With the signing of the Peace of Paris and conclusion of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British Empire seemed to have been raised to a new pinnacle of power and prestige. The fall of the country's international position which followed was therefore all the more dramatic. The main problem facing British policymakers in this period was that of allies. Whilst the 7 Years' War had consolidated the Madrid-Paris-Vienna axis, the Anglo-Prussian alliance had been irrevocably broken by Whitehall's negotiations for a separate peace. Britain may have been ascendant internationally, with new vast swathes of territory in America, whilst the East India Company's rule in Bengal now seemed cemented. Yet, so long as London was friendless on the continent, George III's ministers believed their position was insecure. The task was then to find a new alliance that would distract France from being able to focus solely on her navy, offer protection to the British King's fiefdom of Hanover, and provide the empire with security in another war. For many, the most obvious choice was to rekindle the old system with Austria. This could drive a wedge through the French bloc on the continent, and by leaning on the Habsburgs' position as Holy Roman Emperor, defend Hanover. Approaches were made throughout the 1760s, but the Austrians were uninterested. Maria Theresa still held bitter memories from their earlier relationship, when, so she thought, London had forced her to give up Silesia in the War of the Austrian Succession. More problematically, Kaunitz, the architect of the Habsburg-Bourbon rapprochement, remained wedded to his strategic vision. British diplomats were left muttering about the unnaturalness of the Austro-French alliance, but could do little to change it in the short term. Perhaps then Frederick of Prussia could once again offer the solution. In the years following 1762, this was out of the question whilst Bute, Frederick's arch-nemesis and his ideological allies held office. But with the return of Chatham in 1766, British ministers supposed that Frederick's opinions would change once he was dealing with old friends again. Indeed, the Prussian king did much to encourage these beliefs, if only to sow discord in British policy. When approaches were made in the late 1760s, however, Berlin was as uninterested as Vienna. Frederick had always mainly been concerned with the eastern threat from Russia, and the alliance he had forged since 1762 had finally rid him of this nightmare. As far as he was concerned, Prussia was secure, and all an alliance with Britain could potentially do was involve him in another war with France. Russia also seemed like a serious prospect. This was potentially the most natural alliance of all the options, and several times both sides seemed to come close to reaching an agreement. Yet it always remained just out of reach. Part of the problem was British conceit. Throughout the 1760s, George III's statesmen never missed an opportunity to suggest that the Russians should really be courting them, rather than the other way round. They were also reluctant to give anything in return for an alliance. Catherine was particularly insistent on what would become known as the Turkish Clause, a commitment to provide assistance if the Ottoman Empire attacked Russia. British ministers were unwilling to make such a guarantee, but neither would they contemplate a generous subsidy in lieu of this. A cabinet meeting in 1763 called to discuss a Russian treaty, rejected it unanimously because it required London even to furnish money, the italics here revealing the sense of outrage. Finally then, there was perhaps one more option. Since the Glorious Revolution, France had been Britain's most persistent enemy. Yet even here there was precedent, and alliance from the 1730s had shown promise before its breakdown. Throughout the rest of the 1760s following the Peace of Paris, rapprochement seemed unlikely, as France and Madrid looked for opportunities to revenge their defeat. The result was a series of petty squabbles between the powers over the terms of the peace, from France supposedly labelling the stones removed from the Dunkirk fortifications so they could be quickly reassembled, to the failure of Spain to pay the Manila ransom. Often Britain was actually in the right, but none were worth going to war for, as the Duke of Cumberland said, despite the mindless warmongering that seemed to overtake public opinion at every slight insult. The most dangerous point of these tensions was in 1770, when Spanish claims to the Falkland Islands brought both powers to the point of war. In France, Choiseul was full of belligerence, but Louis XV swerved from yet another confrontation, effectively ending the crisis, for without French support, Spain was helpless. Yet after this, tempers for a time cooled, helped greatly by the arrival of Aiguillon at Versailles, an advocate of friendly relations. Circumstances also seemed favourable. The partition of Poland, a cynical act of international piracy by Austria, Prussia and Russia, suggested that European stability was now to be threatened primarily from the east. Yet a parallel crisis in Sweden at the same time undermined relations. The revolution, which re-established near absolute monarchy in the country, counted as a decisive triumph for French diplomacy, but a great defeat for Russia and to an extent Britain. Yet in the war scare that followed, an alliance with France against Russia was not inconceivable. Indeed, Aiguillon worked actively for it. The outcome was ultimately inconclusive, as Russia decided against intervention in Sweden, and France, warned by Britain, backed down, avoiding war but also the possibility of an alliance. British ministers had seriously considered the prospect of an entente with France, but ultimately, with a public opinion that was often mindlessly francophobic, and could easily be whipped up by the likes of Chatham, they never had the courage to take such a leap. Part of the problem with all of these possible alliances was the scale of British triumph in the 7 Years' War. While the victories worried most powers on the continent, in London ministers became incredulous at the idea they may have to stoop or compromise any great degree to win the favour of lesser powers. Yet on one hand, they did have a point. Why should London tie itself to a continental power on the basis of onerous and expensive terms? As Salisbury was to argue a century later, if the need for an alliance did arise in wartime, Britain was unlikely to get terms much worse than those offered in peacetime. British statesmen's thinking was clouded to some degree by recent history. Every war with a great power, whether it be over rights in the Caribbean or colonial adventures in America, had ultimately ended in a European conflict. It followed that any war with France or Spain would do so again. Yet this was not the policy any longer of Versailles. On the contrary, Choiseul and Vergennes were determined that in another war, France would this time not be distracted by European considerations, and British statesmen themselves, if never wholeheartedly, did come to embrace this logic. As Salisbury later elucidated, for it to work, Britain would have to remain militarily strong in her own right throughout peacetime, committing to something like the two-power standard that Salisbury had made law. But in the era following the 7 Years' War, when national debt was high and the public demanded a peace dividend rather than shouldering the burden that came with their new power, economy was the order of the day. Still, on the surface, something like this was maintained. The Royal Navy had 126 battleships at the end of the 1760s, compared with Spain's 55 and France's 67 ships of the line, but this obscured the fact that since their disastrous performances in the last war, both Bourbon powers, France especially, were focusing on preparing their navies for another round of hostilities. These considerations became increasingly academic in nature, however, as the question of naval standards and continental alliances succumbed to a far more important issue, that of imperial authority in America. From 1774, the pattern of British diplomacy in Western Europe was determined largely by the rebellion of the American colonies. Technically, George III did not issue a proclamation of rebellion until the end of August 1775, while the colonies themselves only declared independence in July 1776. But these formalities had been preceded by armed conflict in the spring of 1775 at Lexington, Concord and Bunker Hill. In fact, as early as 1774, when Lord North decided upon a policy of coercion following the Boston Tea Party, European opinion was well aware that events on the other side of the Atlantic might produce a sudden and spectacular change in the international balance of power. Often, British strategy has depended upon dealing with one threat at a time. Often it has gone wrong, Chamberlain's attempt to settle Europe so as to turn on Japan being the most infamous example. A similar logic was applied to America. Chatham's pleas to face the foreign rather than colonial foe were, probably correctly, ignored. "We must get the colonies in order before we engage with our neighbours," George III declared. To have allowed the colonial governments to act in the dangerously self-willed way they were doing was to undermine British foreign relations. Part of the purpose of America, in London's view, was to allow Britain, not inherently the greatest of European powers, to stand equal or above the likes of France, whether that be as a supplier of raw materials, market for domestic goods, or source of manpower. A colony that could make absolutely all of its own decisions was a source of weakness rather than strength in the mind of British ministers. Though taxation provided the issue on which Britain and the colonies clashed, the central problem was the authority of the imperial government. If America would not obey Parliament in paying imperial taxes, British statesmen alleged there was no guarantee they would do so over other issues vital to the imperial economy and national security later down the line. The colonial question had to be settled before anything else. Given then the main focus of subduing the colonial threat, what should have been British policy towards the Bourbon powers? It was self-evident they would in some way seek to exploit the crisis. Choiseul himself had predicted as much a decade earlier. Should London allow France and Spain, clandestinely at first, to aid the colonies in the hopes that the rebellion could be quelled quickly? Or should Britain stage a preemptive strike? Frederick II, something of an expert on the subject, certainly thought as much. If she wanted to make war on her colonies, he wrote in 1782, she ought at once to have laid up the French navy and bottled up her shipyards, which was very possible in the beginning. Yet in 1774, when Turgot still ruled in Versailles, attempting to impose economies, it seemed unlikely France would risk involving itself in such a quarrel from what appeared to be a position of weakness. Indeed, Vergennes was thought by British statesmen to resemble the Pacific Fleury rather than the belligerent Choiseul. It was a disastrous underestimation of one of the shrewdest foreign ministers France has ever possessed, and the man who would ultimately prove to be the architect of Britain's downfall in America. In hindsight, London was probably correct to avoid a preemptive strike. For the moment, Vergennes had to bide his time. Too early an intervention could reunite rather than divide the British and Americans, and return Chatham, the scourge of the Bourbons, to office to crush France all over again. And besides, so long as Britain could quell the rebellion in good time, no nation would do more than the covert assistance France offered from May 1776. When news of Howe's capture of New York arrived, Vergennes pulled back from the brink. Only if Britain lost a major battle could France be drawn openly into the struggle. It was then British generalship, not British diplomacy, that was to lose England America.